Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 32 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Arizona Coyotes, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. And this was a pretty important game for the San Jose Sharks in the schedule, a chance to really pull within just a few points of the St. Louis Blues for that final playoff spot, as well as gaining some ground on the Arizona Coyotes, considering the St. Louis Blues actually lost tonight against the Anaheim Ducks, which is something that was quite unexpected. And yet the San Jose Sharks going up against the Coyotes for the third time this season, once again, were pretty thoroughly outplayed by Arizona. Even though the Sharks do have a win against this team this season, even in that one, it was a game in which Jones had to more or less stand on his head for the Sharks to get the victory. Otherwise, the Sharks have been pretty much outplayed by Arizona at every single moment, and that's how this game started. The Coyotes would only have one goal in the first period, but they certainly could have gotten a couple more than that if Jones wasn't playing at a very high level in that period, because the Sharks got maybe one or two chances themselves to multiple, like a handful of chances for the Arizona Coyotes in those first 20 minutes. In the second period, the Sharks would manage to tie the game on a shorthanded bid from Tomas Hertl to make it 1-1, but it would be a similar situation to the end of the second period against the Los Angeles Kings in the previous game, where the Coyotes would get this late period goal and they would have a 2-1 lead going into the third period. And we were going to see how the Sharks would respond this time. In the previous game, after that goal was scored, the Sharks came out in the third period and scored two quick goals to expand their lead to 4-1. Would they do the same thing here against the Coyotes? Well, not really. They wouldn't manage to get really anything going all that much in that third period, and the Coyotes instead will expand on their own lead with goals from Dvorak, and then Hunt, and then eventually Kessel to make it 5-1. The Sharks would get one back from Marlowe, but that would be the only scoring for the Sharks in that third period, and they would drop it 5-2. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, so he does get the start here tonight. Obviously, tomorrow will end up being Devan Dubnyk. And when I was talking about Dubnyk before, he had gone on a 3-game streak where he was playing some really, really good goaltending hockey, and then there was a game after that where he lets in 5 goals. I think it was against the St. Louis Blues, and I sort of said Dubnyk kind of falls off here. It was not a very good game. Here tonight, Jones had come in with 4 straight very good games under his belt, and he lets in 5 goals here tonight. But the big difference is that while Dubnyk I don't think was particularly good in his 5-goal outing, I guess you could say, Jones was actually pretty solid in this one. He was essentially the only reason that after 40 minutes the Sharks were only trailing a single goal to this Arizona Coyotes team. He had to make multiple huge saves for the San Jose Sharks, and neither of these first 2 goals, the Dvorak one being a complete just sort of tic-tac-toe play with poor defensive coverage from especially Kevin Labanc in front of the net, as well as Nick Schmaltz's goal, which was essentially identical to the Iafallo goal scored in the previous game. A very, very nice tip in front of the net, and again, poor defensive coverage, this time coming from Brent Burns. But then in the third period, it did kind of fall off a bit for Martin Jones. The Dvorak one, the second Dvorak one on the breakaway, was not an easy save, but it was one that he technically could have made. The fourth goal, basically not really much of a chance on that one. Even got a bit interfered with by Lawson Krause, though not enough for the referee to overturn the goaltending challenge. As well as on the fifth goal. The fifth goal was one he definitely could have had on Phil Kessel, but maybe his confidence was a bit shaken at that point, and in the end it didn't really matter. But at the end of the day, it felt as though Jones actually was probably still the Sharks' best player here tonight, and Sharks kind of let him down in that regard. Having said that, going into the game on Monday, unless Dubnyk puts up like a shutout tomorrow, I would say, we probably see Jones back in net on that one against the Wild. Next, we'll be talking about Ryan Donato, a player who, at the start of the season, he was starting up at times in the second line. On the first line, he was playing some games with, Couture, with Evander Kane. He seemed to be moving around in that top 6, but after a few games, even though Donato was looking pretty good, he ended up getting dropped into the bottom 6, onto the third or even fourth lines, and he hasn't really seen much movement from that bottom 6 into the top 6 since then. And it was understandable, because Ryan Donato, for maybe a good 10-15 game stretch in this middle part of the season, did not look very good at all, but he's definitely been a lot better in these past few games, and yet he still has seen very little movement upwards, and instead a lot of movement downwards. I mean, in the previous game against the Los Angeles Kings, Kings. He played about 8 or so minutes. Here tonight, he did end up getting 12 minutes, but that's really only because the Sharks were in the hole 3 goals late in the third period, so the Booner was more open to playing sort of the fourth line to bump up their time on ice. But realistically, in a game, Donato is really only getting maybe 10 minutes max on this fourth line, which seems kind of strange because he has been pretty good for the San Jose Sharks. And when I see that Donato's getting something like 10 minutes, and then I look at the second line and there's Patrick Marleau sitting on there with Timo Meier and Tomas Hertl. Yes, Marleau scored here tonight, but that was only his second goal on the season. And it just feels kind of weird in that way just to see him still up there. Because I guess I can understand Booner's point where he doesn't necessarily want to play the future of the San Jose Sharks, so someone like John Leonard on that second line, because he still wants to be able to push for the playoffs, so he's trying to play the best player available for that position. But I still don't think Marleau is necessarily that player. Honestly, it seems like a toss-up to me between Balcers and Ryan Donato, and I would have loved to see Donato get a shot back in that top 6 because it's just something that we haven't really seen, and Donato seems to be giving it 100% every single shift in these past few games, and not to say that Marleau isn't doing the same thing, but the second line has left a lot to be desired in my opinion, and with tomorrow's game likely involving a lot of line changes, because we saw as this current game went on, because the Sharks weren't getting much generated offensively besides the first line remaining unchanged, I expect a lot of lineup changes, and I think Donato moving up to that second line might be an interesting one to consider, or at least Balcers in that regard. Next, I'll be talking about Erik Karlsson. A pretty solid game for Erik Karlsson, but also quite sort of up and down. On the offensive side, Karlsson was still rather effective. It wasn't amazing necessarily, but there were a few very, very nice offensive plays, and we saw a lot of vintage Karlsson here tonight. There was that one play where he just kind of nonchalantly moves the puck away from Christian Fischer, who ends up sort of diving at him and sliding to center ice. Just a very, very nice play, and he actually did that a couple of times in this game. The second time, he didn't completely ruin the career of a Coyotes player, but he did really make them look silly. And that was just the offensive side of Erik Karlsson, which was very effective here tonight. But on the defensive side, it's where there's a bit more bad news, and maybe even more bad news than there was earlier in the season with Karlsson's defensive game when he was looking completely lost. Why is that? Because earlier in the season, at the very least, even though Karlsson seemed completely checked out of the game in those first few games of the season, it was something that was fixable, and it has been fixed as of late in this past month or so, where Karlsson has looked a lot better. The problem here tonight was that there were a couple of moments where Karlsson kind of got beat wide, it felt like. There was a moment in the last few minutes of the second period where he gets caught flat-footed, and Derek Brassard is able to just sort of walk around him, and it just seems like though this isn't an issue that Karlsson can necessarily fix, because it might just be sort of a limiting factor based on his body at this point due to the injuries he has sustained with the San Jose Sharks in the past couple of years. He just doesn't seem to have the agility to be able to do this. Now, by agility, I don't necessarily mean speed, because we have seen Karlsson reach some pretty nice speed when he can actually get going, but it seems as though it's really that first step, that sort of stretch moment right at the start before you try and take those first couple of strides that really struggle with Erik Karlsson, and we've seen him in a couple of these types of situations actually get beat at times this season, and we saw it a couple of times here tonight as well. And then finally, we'll talk about Brent Burns, who also did not have a very good game here tonight. On the defensive side, obviously, it was a pretty disastrous. The second goal was definitely his fault. He chases after Nick Schmaltz and lays the hit on him, but it's a very weak hit. Schmaltz sort of bounces off of it and then manages to win the race back to the front of the net to get the tip in before Brent Burns can get back there as well to cover him. And then, of course, on the third goal, he, I guess, thinks Dvorak is a Sharks player and decides to pass the puck directly to him, resulting in this Dvorak breakaway where he manages to push it past Martin Jones. And just in general, not a very good game at all from Brent Burns. But also on the offensive side is something that we've been really missing from Brent Burns' game this season. While it hasn't been all bad, obviously he has 5 goals on the year and 2 of them are like highlight reel goal of the year candidates. it still is kind of a situation where if you had told me that this was a player who 2 years ago had 82 points in 82 games and a few years ago managed to score almost 30 goals in a full season, I probably wouldn't have believed you, because Brent Burns kind of looks like a shell of his former self on the offensive side. It felt like every single time before, every hockey analyst would say, oh, Brent Burns is so good offensively. He always manages to get pucks through to the net. And it's just not really the case anymore. Brent Burns just doesn't seem to have that pedigree in his game anymore. It felt as though a couple years ago, you could count on maybe one or two hands. There was only a handful of games where Brent Burns wasn't a difference maker on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. And yet this season, it's a same amount of games where it has been a difference maker for the San Jose Sharks. You could probably count it on just a single hand. So Brent Burns, the decline of Brent Burns that had seemingly begun last season, we were hoping maybe for a rebound this year, but it doesn't seem to be the case. He's still a defenseman who's eating a ton of minutes for the San Jose Sharks, and maybe that is actually sort of a problem for Brent Burns. Maybe he isn't necessarily able to handle it as he's getting up there in age, but the fact that he continues to get it and the fact that he's not necessarily playing all that fantastic for most of this season has been a problem for the Sharks thus far. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow as they'll take on the Coyotes again, and we'll see if the Sharks can actually, play a decent hockey game against this Arizona squad, because not only are they trying to chase the Blues down for that final playoff spot, but they don't even get into the playoffs passing the Blues if they can't also pass this Coyotes team. Class dismissed.